Hello everyone, welcome back to Info 3560. Today I'm going to explain our practice questions on Blackboard, and I will provide my solution to you. And I believe you've already downloaded these files, and think about your ERD. I believe you thought about your ERD for these given questions. So before start before I provide my solution, I'm going to give a moment for you to read the given practice questions on ERD. Okay, I unloaded three files: ERD practice students, ERD practice cellular, and ERD practice library. And those first two ERD practices are quite simpler than ERD library. So, well, there's only one sentence in the first two practices, but there are many sentences in couple of sentences in libraries. So you may hard to catch the key idea on the library, but I'm going to explain how to catch the key idea and key element from complicated cases. But before start library, let me start with the simpler practices. So I will start ELD practice student. Okay, so if you haven't read the practice yet, please take a moment, please pause this video and take some time for you to read the practices. Okay, so draw an ERD represent a situation of students who attend and work in schools and who also belongs to certain clubs that are located in different schools. So to draw, if I provide my tip to draw ERD, you have to decide what will be entities, okay? And then if you decide entities, you have to give attributes for the entities, because the attributes will be attribute properties and characteristics of instances will be in or will belong to an entity. And then you have to define relationships between entities. Okay, so let's start to find ERD, an entity first. And what can be entities is you have to be repeated, it could be object, it could be event, anything have to be managed in your system. Okay, but you have to be one of the main characteristics of entity is if instances have to be repeated, or you may have to have multiple instances. For the very rare case, you can make a certain entity which only contain just one instance, but normally entities contain or will contain multiple instances. So let's take a look at the situation again. There are students, right? So we can see there are many instances and who attend work and schools. Those could be an object in our situation, right? And student can work and work in multiple schools, and they may belong to certain clubs. So we can see there are many clubs and there are many multiple schools. So I believe it is possible to decide it is possible to, well, it could be recommended to have students in entity and schools entity and clubs entity. So we can find three entities. Okay, Okay. So again, we may have students. Well, I think it's better to have three entities: student, club, and school. Okay. So let's draw three entities first. Okay, this is the application we have seen before, right? SQL developer data modeler. Shortly, it is called data modeler. To draw entity, you have to, well, I think it's better to start with logical model first. The reason is that is the first step. To draw the ELD on logical pane is the first step. And with the ERD, you will draw. It is possible to convert the logical model to relational model. So you can activate the logical model editor or hit right button on it on logical model and show it. Okay, then you can start to draw logical model. And if the logical model is activated, then you will see those icons. But actually, relational model, you may have different icons, which is closer to physical layer. Okay, but that model is close to conceptual model. Okay, so in this local editor, I'm going to draw three entities. Again, three entities, right? Student, club, and school. Okay, to draw students, I can create entity, and the name will be student, right? Student. Okay, and we have to go to attributes, and in this attribute tab, you can add multiple attributes. So there is no detailed information of the entity, but using common sense, we can add some attributes. Will be characteristics of an instance in student entity. Okay, let me add student ID. All right, and it will be primary UID and student first name and last name, and maybe address, street address, city, state, zip code. Okay, so let me apply it, and we will have student entity. And because the default size of entity is default height of entity is smaller than, so too small to show all attributes. So I just increase this height to show all attributes, right? And then let me add other entity. Okay, school, and attribute school, maybe school number or ID. Well, it doesn't matter, but any attribute in the entity have to be primary key. So let me decide if student ID as a primary UID, but it doesn't mean school ID is universal. The ID is only valid for my within my system or within my ERD. Okay, and school name, and we can add more attributes such as school address, city, street address, city, zip code, and state and country. But I'm going to skip the other attributes. Okay, we have school entity, and what about the last entity? The entity have to be club, right? Okay, club. Club ID and club name, and maybe club location, such as building number or room number. Okay, so let's think about the relationships between three entities. Let's go back to the description. So let's find out what possible relationships we have to draw on our ERD. Students who attend schools, right? So students can attend work in multiple schools. So by default, students relationship between student and school have to be at least one too many, right? One too many. Let me draw one too many. Okay, well, let's skip some details like mandatory or optional. So school students can attend multiple school. It is correct from student side. So let's think about school side, such as there are many in one school. There could be multiple students. Normally there are many students in one school, right? In AUM, for instance, AUM has about 5,600 students. What about the other schools? The elementary school you attend, or middle school, or high school? There are a lot of students, right? So the relationship between student and school is not enough. You have to be many to many. Okay, that only explain aspect of student. Students can attend multiple schools, but it doesn't explain aspect of the school. So the relationship between students and school have to be many to many. So let me delete it. So you have to be many to many, right? What about students and clubs? Students can attend, can belong to clubs, right? So just like the relationship between students and school, student can attend multiple clubs, and club there are many students. So the relationship between students and club have to be many to many as well. Let me add many to many. Okay. Let's think about details of the many to many relationships. Students that the ELD students in our ERD needs to attend at least one university, right? So you have to be mandatory many here, and also without student, school cannot exist. So it have to be mandatory many and mandatory many. So let me modify the relationships. It shouldn't be optional. It have to be mandatory. So if you uncheck it, the relationship will be mandatory. So you can see the straight lines, not disconnected. What about students in the club? It is possible to attend the club, but it is not mandatory. So because there isn't a lot of explanation, so we have to use our common sense. You may belong to a certain club, or you may not belong to a club. So the relationship between students and club have to be optional many, right? This side is possibility for student to attend the club. So it have to be optional many, but without student, club cannot exist. So this line have to be disconnected, and this side have to be straight. And let me modify it. If you double click it, then okay, student. So student may or may not to attend the club, right? so it have to be optional, and club should have at least one student. So it shouldn't be optional. So if you uncheck it, it is mandatory. If you check it, it is optional. So the line will be changed like this. Alright, you may think that is all, but there is hidden relationships. So club needs to belong to school, right? In other words, a school may locate multiple clubs, and clubs needs to locate in one club, right? Let me go back to explanation. Students belong to certain clubs that are located in different schools. Okay, so relationship has to be one to many. Well, the explanation is not precise. So there are two possible relationships between school and club: one to many or many to many. But I believe physically clubs need to locate in one school. So let me draw relationship one to many. Okay, so because that is just practice, I didn't I skipped a lot of information. One to many, and well, without school, club cannot exist. So you have to be mandatory one and optional club, because school may not have any club, but it is possible to it is hard to find a case. But well, let me add my assumption: school should have at least one club or many clubs. Then in that case, we can consider cardinality here is a mandatory, not optional. So, but anyway, school needs to club needs to locate in one school. In that case, you have to be straight. In other words, mandatory. So let me modify the relationships. So mandatory. So relationship will be like this, right? So that is my solution for the student practice. Okay. All right. Let me open a file. Okay, where is the cellular? Okay, here it is. Okay, a cellular operator needs a database to keep track of its customers, their subscription plans, and the headsets, mobile phones that they are using. The ER diagram, shortly ERD, in the figure illustrates the key attributes of interest of the operator and the relationships between them. The mobile carrier has contracted with multiple cell phone manufacturers, which provides multiple Handset exclusively runs on operating system. During boot, it is impossible for any device. So, well, one device had to can have only one operating system. Customer can have other lines for their family members. So it is slightly more complicated than the first practice. So again, just like the first ERD, we have to decide entities first. Okay, please take a moment to take a look at this case again and think about your ERD, and you can pause this video. Alright, well, so So have you ever thought about the ELD? So you have to think about what will be entities in your model. We can, well, definitely we can have cell phone entities, right? Entity and subscriber entity and lines as well. Okay. What about uh, handsets? Yes, we have to have, right? What about, let me ask another question. Can a cellular operator could be entity instance in an entity, or do we have to have entity for cellular operator or carrier in this case? No, it can't. The reason is the system will work for a cellular operator, and as long as the system is for cellular operator, we don't need to have multiple operator instances. So cellular operator is a system, not instance in entity. Okay. So you have to, when you decide an entity, you have to think the possible instances in the entity can be repeated, or if the entity may have multiple instances or not. That is a really important characteristic of entity. Alright, let me go back to data modeler, and I'm going to draw new model. Okay, and let me go to logical model. Okay, so first we need to maintain handsets, right? Handsets, and we can give handset ID. They have to be primary, and vendor handset name and vendor or manufacturer and we can add some more attributes such as spec, weight, height, dimension, or other attributes, but I'm going to skip it. OS. So handsets may have at least 4 attributes, but actually if you many of cell phone operator or mobile carrier has much more attributes to maintain handsets instances. So what about other attribute? They need to keep track of the customers, right? Customers. There could be entity, right? Okay. Customers. And customers entity should have primary key, primary UID, or identifier, and you may have their first name and last name. Okay, so that is the minimum, right? Let's think about the relationship between handsets and customers. It could be, many of cases you may think there's 1-to-1 because many of students or many of you guys has only one cell phone, right? But there is a description on lines. Customers can have other lines for their family members. So we have to think about other entity between customers and handsets. Okay. Basically, lines. Let me add line ID. Okay, and well, maybe we need to add plan, voice plan, and data plan, or we can add text plan as well. In line, okay, line I have to be ID, UID. So in one line should have at least just one handset, right? The handset should link with just one line. So the relationship between handsets and line is obviously 1-to-1. Okay, 1-to-1. Alright, what about lines and customers? One customers can have other lines for their family. So that means customers can have at least one or multiple lines. So it have to be the relationships between customers and lines is 1-to-many, right? 1-to-many. So let's draw 1-to-many. Okay, and let's think about if it is mandatory or optional. Without customers, line cannot exist, right? Line needs the customers, and customers may have multiple or at least one. So they have to be mandatory as well, right? So we have to modify. That means we have to modify the relationship between lines and customers. So we should have multiple mandatory many and mandatory one. So that is the relationships between lines and customers and handsets and lines, right? But we can add more attributes to make it better ERD, right? So this is the my solution for cell phone practice. Okay, let's move to the next practice. So unlike the previous two practices, it is a little I think it's quite demanding. But if you spend 10 to 15 minutes to understand the library practice, you should be able to make a summaries. You should be able to summarize the case. Okay. So for now, please pause the video and spend 10 to 15 minutes to understand this practice. Okay, so I assume all of my subscribers on YouTube, all my subscribers and students spend some time to read and understand this case. Okay, this case is simplified version of new system for your university library. So it is very simplified version of ERD. Actually, the library system is much more complicated than this one. Okay, so unlike the characteristic of this practice, it is complicated, and also it provides attributes, unlike the previous two cases. So that means all possible attributes for an entity needs to be added in your ERD. Okay, so in the previous example, we use our guesstimation to add attributes, but we don't need to think about attributes because attributes are already given in this case. Okay, so we have to decide in entity, right? What entities what entities should we have in our ERD? You may not have any idea, or you may have. So if you're not sure what entities you have to have, then you have to make a summary. You have to make summarized sentences into this form. Okay. Okay. Let me type a form of the summary. So we can write a sentence in the form subject plus verb plus object, right? So you should try to make a summaries into this form. And subject and object in your sentence, summarized sentence, or sometimes verb. Well, very often cases verb could be in entity as well, right? So let's summarize. Let's make a summary. Okay. First, patrons borrow books, right? And if there is no available book, patrons reserve on book or physical book or book title. If a patron wants the book that is already checked out, the patrons can put the title on reserve. So reserve on book title. Okay. And sometimes you may not have object. Okay, but let me give you an example. Book title contains books, right? Under one book title there might be multiple books. So if you want, you can find find the case when you go to library. You may see the multiple same books on the same book title, right? And patrons consist of undergraduate and graduate and faculties. So that is what I found so far, right? So you may have more summarized sentence, but I could find 4. So let's with these 4 sentences, let's draw ERD. Okay, so I'm going to copy these sentences and I will paste to my ERD model, and I will going to create new design. Alright, and then if I paste here, edit, Okay, patrons borrow books. So let me copy, and I will go to logical border. Okay. With these sentences, let's find entities: patrons, books, patrons, book titles, book titles. And book titles and books, right? Patrons and undergraduate, graduate, and faculties. Those subjects and object can be an entity in our model. So let me draw patrons. Okay. And the common attributes for patrons, different patron groups such as undergraduate, graduate faculties are described in the case. So let's go back to patrons. Okay, here there are faculty patrons, graduate student patrons, and undergraduate student patrons. Basic information about all patrons is name, address, and telephone number, right? But actually we always need to have primary key. So patron ID have to be primary UID, and the common attributes are name, address, telephone number, and telephone number. But as we already learned in Oracle database, the only three possible special characters are either underscore, dollar, or shop. So I'd recommend to use underscore if you want to use multiple nouns. Okay, so those are common attributes. Okay, so because patrons, there are three different type of patrons. We make three different patrons as well, right? Alright, let me create faculty patrons first. Okay, and I will create a faculty here and faculties. And if you want to faculties a subgroup or children entity of certain entity, you can find the super type. Okay, so faculties is sub entity under patrons, and if you hit up OK, then you will see faculties is located within patrons. You can move this out from patrons. Okay, so as long as the faculty is sub entity of the patrons, all four attributes will be inherited to faculties. Okay, so you only need to have unique attributes for faculties. Let's find the unique attribute for faculties. Okay, so for faculty patrons, additional information is office address and office telephone number. Okay, office address and office telephone number. That is it. What about graduate students? Let me copy and I will create new entity. But even if you create a sub entity or subtype, you have to click the empty area. Okay, and then you will in the pub window you can make this entity as subtype, and let me choose patrons, and you'll see graduate students. Okay, graduate students located within the entity. Okay, let me resize it. Okay, let me add unique attributes for a graduate student, graduate program, and advisor. Graduate program and advisor have to be maintained for graduate entity. Okay, I'm going to resize it because I need to contain undergraduate patrons as well. What about undergraduate? Program and total credit hours have to be maintained. Okay, and I will create new entity undergraduate. Okay, program and total credit hours. Okay, so if you don't make patrons as super type for or super type of the undergraduate, the new entity will be located out of patrons. So you have to make sure the patron is a super type. Okay, so it is now within patrons. Alright, so with these entities and sub entities, we could explain patrons consist of undergraduate, graduate faculties. So let me delete it. Okay, let me strike out. And patrons can borrow books, right? So that means we need to have books entity. Okay, and let me have books. Okay, like books. And if you take a look at carefully, there are attributes for the books. Okay, where is the okay book? Okay, book copy. So what we shouldn't confuse is what patrons can borrow is book copies, not book title, right? So let me modify a little bit. Book copies, and patrons can reserve on book title. They don't make a reserve on book copy. The reason is once they make a reservation on a certain book title, if any book copy under the book title is returned, patrons will get notification, right? So they can make a reservation on book title, but they can borrow book copy. That's the difference. So what patrons borrow is book copy. So let me create a book copies, and book copies needs to maintain copy number, right? The copy number have to be primary key. Okay, copy number and edition. Copy have the primary UID and publication year. And ISBN and book status, whether it is returned or not, or whether it is on shelf or loaned out. Okay, well that will be enough for a book copy for now. And because patrons can borrow multiple book copies, right? You have to be, patrons should be able to borrow many book copies, right? If and also book copies can be borrowed for multiple patrons once the book copy is returned. Book copy is not only for one patron. So basically, the relationships between patrons and book copies is many to many, right? What if the relationship is one to many? Patrons can borrow only one book copy, but book copies can be borrowed for multiple patrons. What about one to many relationships? Patrons can borrow multiple copies, but book copies only for one patron. That means once the book copy is borrowed by one patron, the book copy cannot be borrowed from other patrons. This is awkward, right? So relationships between patrons and book copies have to be many to many. And what about the mandatory or optional? It have to be mandatory or optional. So let's think these relationships. Patrons, if this is mandatory here, patrons should borrow at least one book copy. Isn't it awkward? Still, I could see some students who never borrowed book from library. So we can't mandate patrons to borrow at least one book copy, right? So you have to be optional on this side. And also, there might be some book copies are still not borrowed for any patrons. So you have to be optional for both sides. So if you double click it, and you can choose two options. Alright. What about other relationships? Patrons can reserve book titles, right? So what I have to do is create book title entity. Alright, now let me create book title. Book title. And book title needs to have at least those information, okay? Title, but before add title, we need to make sure book title ID, we need to make sure add primary key, right? And book title and author. But although there are many multiple authors for one book title, but we'll maintain our ERD as simplified version. So let me just have author, publisher, and catalog number. Catalog number could be primary key. So let me delete book title ID, but that will be primary UID. So to delete, you have to select it and click this button, and it will be primary UID, and you can move this up. Okay. Alright. And just like relationships between patrons and book copies, you have to be optional many and optional many, right? If you mandate mandatory many to many, then it will be awkward, and I will explain why it will be awkward. So, okay. Many to many. So when you draw relationships, especially with the entity which contains sub-entities, you have to click this area. If you click undergraduate or graduates or faculties, that relationship is only for the specific sub-entity. Okay, let me explain. I choose graduate student. And then if you do like this, then that only targets graduate students. It doesn't target the relationships from book title is not for patrons, not for faculties, not for undergraduate. It is only for graduate students. But we need to draw relationships between patrons and book title. Okay. For now. So let me explain why the mandatory relationships. There shouldn't be mandatory relationships between patrons and book title. If it is mandatory here, patrons should borrow at least one book title and should make a reservation at book one title. Have you ever made any reservation on book title? Sometimes you can borrow book copy without reservation, right? And what about this side? If it's mandatory, without reservation, patrons can't. If it's mandatory here, book title needs to be always to be reserved by patron. It's also awkward because if the book copies under the book titles is available, patrons don't need to make any reservation, right? So we have to make those two as optional. Okay, so we are done by patrons and book copies and book titles. And what about book titles contains book copies? There is relationship between book title and book copy. So under one book title, there might be multiple book copies, right? And that means the relationship has to be one to many. Okay. All right. Let's think about the relationships. If you allow optional here, book copies can exist with the book title. Isn't it awkward? Book copies needs to belong to at least one book title. Without book title, book copies cannot be maintained, right? So it have to be mandatory. What about mandatory here? Without book copies, without at least one book copies, if you only have a book title, it is meaningless, right? So you have to be optional as well. That means we have to make those relationships mandatory one to mandatory many. So okay, let me modify book copies and can borrow book copies. Okay, so we could explain for summarized sentence which is extracted from our practice. Actually, there's a missing information. For instance, depending on the type of patrons, it is the available period, right? And also priority is different. And you can, if you double click the many to many relationships between patrons book copy and patrons book title, you can add those attributes such as book copies. Let me double click it, and it is alone, right? Without name, the relationships between book copies and book copies and patrons is just relation 1_1. It is meaningless. But if you rename it like loan, will has more meanings. And in loan, under loan relationships, you can add more attributes such as period. And okay, what about relationships between patrons book title? You may have different priority, right? It have to be mentioned around here. This another class. Okay. Oh, date reserved. Let me double click this first, and I'm going to rename it of the relationship. Reserve. Okay. Or reservation. And date reserved, priority, and date fulfilled. Alright, so I just added more attributes for loan and reservation. And if I convert this model to a relation model, then you will have intermediate entity between patrons and book copies and patrons and book title. Although we don't have intermediate relationships here. Okay, but before to convert to this model to relation model, you have to make sure attribute type. Let me double click one. To explain it. Let me double click one entity. All right, we have attributes, right? But data type is not decided yet. So before deciding all the data types in your ERD, you can't convert. Actually, it is possible to convert, but it is meaningless. Okay. So let me just before, what I want you to do is decide all the data types of all your entity, and then engineer this model to relational model. Okay, then the copies, let me move it slightly, and as you can see, although we don't have a loan and reservation between patrons and book copies and patrons and book title, we have loan and reservation, right? Let me extend it. And also those three sub entities doesn't locate it within patrons. It shows different relationships, right? So in the physical model, you will see physically those three entities doesn't locate within the patrons, but this arrow explains faculties and graduate students and undergraduates are sub entity or entity which inherit characteristics or attribute from patrons. So that is my model. Okay, that is my model, and I hope you guys to think and draw your ELD. Okay, the reason is I'm going to you will have assignments to draw ERD, and also in your final exam you have to draw ERD. Besides, you may think, oh, I can understand how to draw ERD, but actually you can't at this level, at this moment. The hardness to understand ERD and hardness to draw your ERD is way different. Okay, it's a lot of differences. Even if you don't understand how to draw ERD and concept and understand to the key process to extract key ideas from the explanation, you cannot directly draw ERD without multiple practices. Okay, so I want you guys to draw the ERD by yourself. even if you already watched this video, you have to, I want you guys to draw the ERD without seeing my solution. You will need to practice lot of times. Okay, so again, please draw your own ERDs with these given practices, right? And also you can, if you see the some other textbooks, then you'll see a lot of examples on ERD. And this is well, knowledge from my previous semesters. Many of my students believed they can draw ERD without practice, but actually they couldn't. So some students just didn't answer any ERD questions in the final exam. If you don't be one of them, then please practice. Okay, so well, this is my this is what I really want to emphasize. I hope you guys enjoy my video clip, and I will see you guys in the next video clip.